Step 2 on how to fix America: fixing corruption. We can never completely get rid of corruption, it's human nature, but we can and should at least fix a system that legally encourages it. It's actually the legal structure and rules of our system that inevitably produce corruption. Whether the people are good or bad doesn't matter. It's the actual rules of our system that inevitably produce and encourage corruption. Knowing how our system produces that corruption is the first steps in fixing it. So, we're going to talk about campaign financing, gerrymandering, and our first past the post voting system. First, let's point out that the government that you and I learn about in school is not the government that we actually have. We learn that we have a representative democracy, a republic with checks and balances of power, and one that is ultimately dependent upon the people. But what we actually have today is a plutocracy. That is not an exaggeration. A plutocracy is a government of and for the wealthy, dependent upon the wealthy. And that's exactly what we have today. But this is obviously not what we were meant to have. The framers of the Constitution wanted to create a government that was, quoting from the Federalist Papers, quote, dependent upon the people alone, unquote. They attempted to strengthen this dependency on the people alone in multiple ways, like, for example, having regular elections. Making the government dependent upon voters and dependent on nothing else was one of the guiding principles behind the Constitution. Article 1 of the Constitution, Section 9, Clause 8, quote, no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept of any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state, unquote. This clause made sure to eliminate any possible dependency on a foreign power. The ineligibility clause, Article 1, Section 6, Clause 2, was made to avoid any dependency of the legislative branch on the president. It made it illegal for the president to appoint members of Congress to a civil office or give them any newly made titles in order to increase their status and income. Alexander Hamilton described this clause as, quote, an important guard against the danger of executive influence upon the legislative branch, unquote. He said this because he and others understood how competing dependencies could and would corrupt the behavior in our government. The only dependency was meant to be the people. Federalist Paper number 57, quote, the House of Representatives is so constituted as to support in the members a habitual recollection of their dependence on the people, unquote. Unfortunately, it is crystal clear today that our government is not dependent upon the people. Today, that dependent upon the people system is corrupt. It has become dependent upon the ultra-wealthy. There are two main mechanisms that the wealthy use in perfectly legal and in absolute plain sight of everybody to turn our republic, our representative democracy, into a plutocracy: campaign financing and gerrymandering. Today, we legally allow the wealthy to buy our laws and politics through campaign financing and a political system where the politicians choose their voters through gerrymandering. It hasn't always been like this. We should understand how we got here so that we can understand how we fix it. For those of you who don't believe me when I say we live in a plutocracy,
researchers at Princeton University looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a pretty simple question: does the government represent the people? Now, this is what they found. This axis here represents public support for any given idea. On the left, at 0%, are ideas that not a single American wants. On the right, at 100%, are ideas that everyone supports. This axis represents the likelihood of Congress passing a law that reflects any of these ideas, from a 0 to a 100% chance. On this graph, an ideal republic would look like this. If 50% of the public supports an idea, there's a 50% chance of it becoming law. If 80% of us support something, there's an 80% chance. You get the idea. Now, most Americans would probably agree that, with a few exceptions, we should be as close to this ideal as possible. Unfortunately, the way America actually works doesn't even come close. Take an idea that nobody supports, literally nobody, and it has about a 30% chance of becoming federal law. Now, take an incredibly popular idea, the most popular idea this country has ever seen, and there's also about a 30% chance of it becoming law. This means that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law. Put another way, and I'm just going to quote the Princeton study directly here, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. So if you've ever felt like your opinion doesn't matter and that the government doesn't really care what you think, well, you're right. But there's a catch. This flat line only accounts for the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, people who can afford lobbyists, they get their own line. Look at how much closer their line is to the ideal. When they want something, the government is much more likely to do it. And when they don't, they have the power to completely block it from happening, no matter how much the rest of the country supports it. They get what they want, and guess who ends up paying for it?
So, again, the two parts of our system that are producing the corruptions illustrated in that clip are gerrymandering and campaign financing. When we can identify the problem, we know where to focus our energies, and these are the problems. Let's start with gerrymandering. The normal system is when states change voting districts to match changes in population, so that each representative is representing about the same amount of people. Every 10 years, the Census Bureau counts the country's population. After they count, it is decided how many congressional seats or representatives each state receives. Then the states redraw their voting district lines, which determines which voters will vote in which districts. This is called redistricting. Now, who draws these lines and how is key, and this is where the corruption of gerrymandering comes in. The decision makers responsible for drawing these lines are different from state to state, but in 31 states, the line drawers are the state legislatures, which one of the two political parties usually controls. Who's in charge of redistricting is different from state to state, and you can see a breakdown here. But again, in 31 states, it's the state's legislature. So when these state legislatures redraw these lines, how they draw them can significantly favor their political party. It's not illegal, so they of course do it. This is gerrymandering. When the line drawers draw the district lines in order to drastically favor their political party in future elections. The party in control of redistricting draws the lines using tactics called packing or cracking. You can look these words up if you're interested in exactly how gerrymandering works, but just know that in the age of computers and algorithms, gerrymandering can be done with surgical precision and amazing effectiveness. Gerrymandering allows political parties a way to consistently win and hold on to power that has nothing to do with earning your vote. It also causes disproportional representation, where the party that wins the most votes does not win the most seats. For example, in Wisconsin in 2012, one party won 49% of votes but got 60% of the seats in the state legislature. Gerrymandering rigs the system. In gerrymandered districts, there's no real chance for the other side to win, and we call these congressional seats safe seats. Roughly 90% of all seats in Congress are considered safe seats. Again, there's no real chance for the other side to win in these districts. There doesn't need to be a debate of ideas to earn your vote, and 90% of districts are considered safe. This problem ends up choosing politicians not based on their ideas or beliefs for solving issues, but simply based on if they have a D or R in front of their name. This ultimately gives us incompetent politicians who don't truly represent their constituents, and this is clearly a problem. However, the solution here, conveniently, would actually also fix another fundamental problem in our politics, our two-party system. A two-party system is inevitable given the voting system that we use. Our type of voting system is actually responsible for our two-party system. If we simply update our voting system to a more sensible one, we would simultaneously cure the corruption of gerrymandering and end up with more than two political parties. Our current way of voting is called first-past-the-post voting. Everyone votes for one candidate, and the person with the most votes wins it all. To save time, I'll put a link in the description that explains why the first-past-the-post voting system inevitably produces two parties. So let me skip to the point. The voting system that we need is called the Single Transferable Vote System, or STV. It is a type of proportional representative voting system, which most democracies today actually use some form of, just not ours. In fact, almost 3/5 of well-established democracies use proportional representation to elect their main legislative bodies. There are two key differences between first-past-the-post and STV. First, In STV voting system, you rank your candidates by preference. This allows you to vote for who you actually want and not strategically based on how everyone else will vote. Secondly, it's not a winner-take-all result. Results are proportional based on the makeup of the voting district. So, if 2/3 of voters are birds and 1/3 are squirrels, then that district would receive 2 bird representatives and 1 squirrel representative. This eliminates gerrymandering because in multi-member STV districts, the results are proportional no matter where the lines are drawn. It becomes pointless to crack or pack a district, and Republicans voting in blue states or Democrats voting in red states would suddenly matter. We need to have this goal in our sights so that we can drive for it over time. In the meantime, we should have independent redistricting commissions that use algorithms to make districts competitive instead of the opposite, as well as implementing ranked choice voting. I understand that this may be a bit much to take in the few minutes that I've talked about it, so I'll put another link in the description that clearly explains STV voting in more detail. In short, we simply need to stop using the outdated first-past-the-post voting system and adopt some form of ranked choice proportional representative voting, like the single transferable vote system. It will simultaneously rid our system of gerrymandering and the problems that come with a two-party government. Corrupting mechanism number 2, campaign financing. This one everyone seems to realize but can't do anything about. When the people whose sole professional purpose is to represent us, when they receive money and gifts from wealthy and powerful people that strongly influence their behavior, the system will become a plutocracy. So the normal system is how people running for office get noticed, get their messaging out, and become recognized by voters, or election campaigning. The corruption here is where the money comes from for those campaigns and where the extra benefits come from for working on Capitol Hill. We need some context for this. The total spent on election campaigns by all candidates for Congress for both House and Senate in 1974 was $77 million. 36 years later, in 2010, the same number, the total spent on election campaigns, was $1.8 billion. That's a 2,237% increase. What happened between 1974 and 2010? There were 2 main things that happened here that led to the explosion of money in our elections. This is the context. Number 1, there was a natural increase in the basic costs of campaigns. Campaigns became more sophisticated, more dependent on things like pollsters and consultants and television commercials. In this New York Times article from 1968, the campaign manager was described as, quote, the newest American phenomenon, unquote. But more importantly and significantly, the second thing that happened. Political races between the 2 parties became much more competitive than they had previously been, and therefore much more worth fighting over. In the 62 years between 1933 and 1995, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives 58 out of those 62 years, and they controlled the Senate in all but 10 of them. Then came the Democrat Lyndon Johnson, the Civil Rights Movement, and the passing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which all had a lot to do with why politics became more competitive again, and the newly competitive fight between the 2 parties would attract more and more money. It still took time for this political shift to fully and clearly shake out in the Congress, but finally in 1994, raising an unprecedented $618 million compared to Democrats' $489 million, Republicans took control of both houses of Congress for the first time since 1954. That put everyone on notice that Congress was up for grabs again, and in the 15 years between 95 and 2010, control of Congress changed hands as many times as it had in the previous 45 years. As Lawrence Lasik put it in his book, Lost Republic, quote, it was at this moment that the modern Congress, call it the fundraising Congress, was born. This fundraising, in turn, changed what leadership in both parties would mean. If leaders had once been chosen on the basis of ideas or seniority or political ties, now, in both parties, leaders were chosen at least in part on their ability to raise campaign cash. Leading fundraisers became the new leaders. Fundraising became the new game, unquote. In fact, today, both parties have specific fundraising levels that you need to reach in order to serve on an influential House committee.
Both the DCCC and the NRCC have actual fundraising quotas members must reach in order to get leadership roles or serve on powerful committees. Even lower-ranking House Democrats owe between $400K and $500K in dues to the DCCC, while top leadership posts for Democrats range from $700K to $900K. The Republican side isn't any better. Committee chairs were expected to raise between $875K up to $1.2 million for their party in 2018. Our campaign finance system needs serious reform, so our legislators can spend their days legislating, not fundraising.
So, the birth of the fundraising Congress, as Lawrence Lasik calls it, is exactly when, and it's no coincidence, that the economic message of Democrats, Bill Clinton for example, became much more pro-big business. Both parties, in fact, began to change their messaging in order to best play this new fundraising game. So when it came to the economy, for example, we no longer had two political parties. Quote, "The country has just won, the money party," unquote, is how Dan Clausen, Alan Neustadt, and Mark Wheeler put it in their book, Dollars and Votes, How Business Campaign Contributions Subvert Democracy. Another way to say that is that America had become a plutocracy. This fundraising game has played out in numerous ways on America. One interesting way it played out is polarization. There's a lot of talk about polarization in America today, and we see it all around us, but it's never given context or tied properly to the systems that are causing that polarization, or at the very least, fueling it. So this fundraising game also caused the non-economic messages of both parties to change and tend to lean more extreme. A moderate, reasonable, calculated message to your party's middle does not tend to elicit many donations, but a strong and direct message to the extreme does tend to elicit donations. As one study summarized the research, quote, "Extremism is not the only way to raise money, but to some legislatures, extremism is an advantage," unquote. So, when you add a fundraising advantage from messaging to the extreme ends of the political spectrum, along with the safe seats in Congress from gerrymandering, you get politicians who have lots of room to message to the most extreme elements of their party because swing voters don't matter and it makes fundraising easier. So, as is the case in our consumer product media model discussed in step 1 on how to fix America, so too is the case with our campaign financing system. Extremism pays. We need to realize and understand that the systems that we have are literally producing and incentivizing polarization and extremism. So, that's a long fun fact about why this corruption is fueling the polarization that we see today. But that's not my main point. Our campaign financing fundamentally undermines and corrupts our system. It makes old school bribery look quaint. It all works to create a plutocracy. It works for the rich while mostly neglecting everyone else. Campaign financing essentially puts legalized bribery at the heart of how our system functions. It may not be the old school crude bribery of this for that exchanges, but it has the same effect. In fact, it truly has an even worse effect. Instead of explicit this for that bribes, which is illegal, we have gift giving and winks with middlemen called lobbyists.
We own them.
How many congressional offices did you actually own?
Jack Abramoff may be the most notorious and crooked lobbyist of our time. Today, he's a symbol of how money corrupts Washington.
I had 2 people on my staff whose virtual full-time job was booking tickets.
The best tickets to all the area's sporting events and junkets to the world's great golf destinations, food and drinks on the house, access to private jets.
And the congressman or senator could take his favorite people from his district to the game?
Congressman or senator could take 24 of his favorite people.
Was all that legal?
At times we didn't care.
Abramoff targeted Volz and offered him a job.
You're the chief of staff of a powerful congressman, and Jack owns you. And you haven't even left working for the congressman.
We were guilty of engaging in a corrupt relationship, so there were several corrupting moments. There isn't just one moment, there were many.
You could own the office by offering a job to the chief of staff, say, I'm having 2 reactions. One is brilliant, and the other is I'm sick to my stomach.
Right, evil. Everything that we want, they're going to do. And not only that, they're going to think of things we can't think of to do.
Subverting the essence of our system.
Absolutely right. But our system is flawed and has to be fixed.
That's one brief look inside the guts of how our system has been corrupted. On top of those gifts given out by lobbyists, our politicians are allowed to trade stock while in office. So they can give themselves gifts and often benefit personally from the bills that they pass or block. and sometimes don't need much influence from lobbyists because they're already on the same team. The obvious solution for this problem would be to make stock trades illegal for sitting House members, but that doesn't address the lobbyists. Lobbyists aren't criminals with briefcases of cash, they're educated professionals. Yet this legal professional industry has made corruption even more dangerous and pervasive because it makes it systemic. It is a central and accepted legal feature embedded into our system, not a pesky bug in the system happening in back rooms and behind closed doors. The lobbying industry today doesn't feel that what they do is wrong, so they have no shame about what they do. And in recent history, this shameless, very legal industry has exploded. In 1971, according to a Hacker and Pearson report, there were 175 registered lobbyists in DC. In 2009, there were 13,700 registered lobbyists. And according to the New York Times and Washington Post, those lobbyists spent more than $3.4 billion to influence Congress. That's more than $6 million for each representative. The money pouring into this fundraising game and the lobbying industry that feeds on it has fundamentally changed how our system functions. I will highlight two of those changes. Two ways that our politics have been bent and shaped by campaign financing and lobbying. Number one, today's politicians spend as much as 80% of their time fundraising. Here's what a senator from South Carolina from 1966 to 2005, Ernest Hollings, said in an article that he wrote after he retired. Quote, "I had to collect $30,000 a week each and every week for 6 years. I could have raised $3 million in South Carolina, but to get to $8.5 million, I had to travel to New York, Boston, Chicago, Florida, California, Texas, and elsewhere. During every break Congress took, I had to be out hustling money. And when I was in Washington or back home, my mind was still on money." Unquote. Robert Byrd, who was a senator for 51 years and holds the record for the longest serving U.S. senator in history, said that the Senate had become, quote, "full-time fundraisers instead of full-time legislatures," unquote. Author, senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and expert on campaign financing, Anthony Corrado, said that our politicians, quote, "are essentially campaigning and raising money all the time," unquote. You might ask yourself, who are they raising all this money from? 0.5% of the population are responsible for the majority of money collected from individuals. In 2013, not a single member elected to Congress or the Senate won without financial assistance from the wealthiest 0.5%. And that's not to mention the overwhelming impact that large corporations have on the system. These statistics are just for individuals. 40% of all political donations come from the top 0.01%. As Bob Dole put it, poor people don't give campaign contributions. So we end up with a situation where our representatives rely on ultra-wealthy donors and so have become glorified telemarketers, raising money from and essentially working for these individuals is what they do. Former Representative of Indiana, Tim Romer, says members, quote, "spend too much of their time dialing for dollars rather than sitting in their committee rooms and protecting the dollars of their constituents," unquote. He's right. Total committee meetings of any kind have dropped like a rock. Here's the average for each decade since the 1970s. Oregon's representative since 1987, Pete DeFazio, said, quote, "You have to pretty much neglect your job. You're spending all this time on telephones talking mostly to people you don't know," unquote. You might think this sounds exhausting and that if anyone would want to fix this system, it's the members of Congress who have to work in it. It's actually life after Congress that is a main reason why members don't want to fix this fundraising circus. Which brings me to fundamental change number two. Fundamental change number one, our politicians spend the majority of their time fundraising from ultra-wealthy individuals and corporations. Fundamental change number two is that the difference in salaries, the pay gap between representatives in government and lobbyists, has changed drastically, meaning the temptation for our current lawmakers to work for corporations rather than the people who elect them is overwhelming today. This pay gap fuels the so-called revolving door, the switching of top executives between industries and the government or the regulatory agencies meant to watchdog and regulate those industries. In 1969, the starting salary for a lobbyist with strong Capitol Hill experience could expect to make slightly more than the $10,000 they received as a congressional staff. Today, the congressional staffer making $50,000 looks across the street at a peer in lobbying who makes 5 or 6 times what they do. Many of our politicians see their time on Capitol Hill as an investment. They work for 5 or 8 years as a staffer for a major committee or senator, and then they cash out and become a lobbyist. The number of House members in the 1970s who did this, who became lobbyists after their time in office, 3%. Of the House members who left office between 1998 and 2004, 43% became registered lobbyists after leaving public office. 3% in 1970s, and 30 years later, 43%. Here's a good real-life example of this. In 2011, the former chairman of the FCC, Michael Powell, as well as the FCC commissioner, Meredith Baker, both became lobbyists for Comcast after voting to approve Comcast's mega merger with NBC Universal, which should have violated antitrust laws. Michael Powell's new salary for becoming Comcast's chief lobbyist was reportedly more than $2.2 million a year. This is what we refer to as the revolving door, and this is how industries capture the government body that is supposed to be regulating them. The pay gap between the public office and private sector lobbyists is so big now that the revolving door is moving faster and faster, and it's harder and harder for politicians to understand who they work for. This is a major way how the powerful control our government. What's the solution here? How do we stop this revolving door? There's no silver bullet here, but 3 ways that would significantly slow down the revolving door are: 1. Make it illegal to become a lobbyist or start a lobbying firm for 5 years after leaving a public office. 2. Make it illegal for a group or entity to lobby and give political donations. You can lobby or you can give donations, but you cannot do both at the same time. And 3. Pay our public officials a more competitive salary to reduce or eliminate the previously mentioned pay gap and subsequent temptations. Singapore, for example, has consistently ranked among the least corrupt countries according to Transparency International, and they have the highest paid politicians in the world. Meanwhile, back in America, our politicians do favors for corporations because they're hoping to land better jobs in those corporations after their time in government, and our politicians have become full-time fundraisers, dialing up the ultra-wealthy to see what they can do to gain their support. Here is an emblematic example of exactly how all of these corruptions play out for us in real life. In the spring of 2011, the United States faced many public policy problems. We were in the middle of 2 official wars, 13 million Americans were unemployed, almost 15% were on food stamps, and 20% of kids were living in poverty. There was an ongoing battle about healthcare and the public debt. There were continuing fights over taxes, immigration policy, and sustainable energy legislation. The appropriations bill and budget had not been passed yet, and we were facing a government shutdown. So, which one of these pressing issues do you think got the most attention? Which issue did Congress spend most of its time on? According to members of Congress, Hill staffers, lobbyists, and Treasury officials, the most consuming issue in Washington at this time was a bill to limit the amounts banks could charge for the use of debit cards, so-called swipe fees. This bill, addressing the amount banks can charge retailers for the use of a debit card, was the most important issue for giant corporations, and so it was the most important issue for lobbyists, and therefore, because of how our system works, it was the most important issue for Congress too. Research done by the Sunlight Foundation shows there were 118 revolving door lobbyists, ex-government officials, and aides that were lobbying for the banks, and 124 that were hired to lobby for the retailers. It was a battle between giant corporations and banks. This issue dominated Congress's calendar, and beyond it, as reported by Huffington Post, Ryan Grimm and Zach Carter, quote, a handful of other intra-corporate contests consuming most of what remains on the congressional calendar, a squabble over a jet engine, industry tussling over healthcare spoils, and the never-ending fight over the corporate tax code, unquote. But as Grimm and Carter explained when talking about how and why our system is broken, quote, one of the least understood explanations is also one of the simplest. The city is too busy refereeing disputes between major corporate interest groups, unquote. Analysis by Frank Baumgartner and his colleagues from the University of Chapel Hill echo this point. Quote, the bad news is that the wealthy seem to set the agenda, and there's little overall correspondence between the congressional agenda and the public's agenda. And because of this, many issues never get raised in the first place, unquote. We never have any real reform that you want to see because we've given the agenda to the ultra wealthy, and we've given veto power over any reform to the giant corporations. In the words of Lawrence Lasig, a government in which policy gets sold to the highest bidder is not long for greatness. This is a picture of a government that is broken, and it is doing untold damage to our society and will continue to do damage until we fix campaign financing, gerrymandering, and our voting system. And that brings me finally to the 4-part solution to the campaign financing problem. First, we give $100 tax credit or voucher, or what some call democracy dollars, to every voting citizen to give to the politician of their choice. Second, we match and multiply small donations, or for every vote received, a dollar amount is received along with it. This would be alongside the tax credits of $100. Third, only natural citizens are allowed to give money to campaigns. No artificial entity like corporations or limited liability companies or other incorporated entity can give or spend money on campaigns. And finally, all campaign donations or expenditures must be publicly disclosed. In this system, if you followed the money, it would lead to the people. This would again strengthen the dependency upon the people alone that our founding fathers had intended. In conclusion, to fix our corrupted political system, we need to transition to a proportional representational voting system like STV, and in the meantime, create independent redistricting commissions across all states and implement ranked choice voting. That would address gerrymandering and eventually the two-party system. To address our campaign financing and the plutocracy we live with, we need 8 changes. We need to provide political vouchers or tax credits to every voter in America. Match and multiply small donations, or for every vote received, a dollar amount is received. Limit campaign contributions to only natural citizens. Publicly disclose all campaign donations and expenditures. Prohibit lobbying for 5 years after leaving public office. Make lobbying and donating at the same time illegal. Prohibit lawmakers from trading stocks. And pay our politicians more competitive salaries. To get started, we first need to just know this information. Just knowing this is half the battle. Minds always change before laws change. But be sure that these proposals represent the biggest threat to the most powerful people in our plutocracy. This is like proposing a democratic republic to a king. They will push back on these changes harder than you've ever seen before, which should tell you exactly how important they are. Establishing a real democracy for ourselves needs to come from us, from the people. If you choose to only care about one issue, this should be it. Something tangible that you can do right now is to support the organization Represent Us. I have zero affiliation with them. They simply understand these problems and make efforts to advance good solutions forward. Check out their website for more on how you can help. Minimizing corruption should be the #1 priority for any state. The only reason why fixing the media is step 1 and fixing corrupt political systems is step number 2 is because first people need to know about it, and now you do. So spread the word. Thank you for your time in watching this video and caring enough to educate yourself.